In the spring of 1976, in Boone County, Iowa, the air didn't just smell like damp earth and diesel exhaust. It smelled like money. To any man standing on the edge of a section line, looking out over the flat, black expanse of the Des Moines Lobe, the world felt like it was expanding at the seams. The 1970s had brought a fever to the Midwest, a gold rush mentality that had turned quiet farmers into aggressive entrepreneurs. In Washington, the Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butz, had issued a command that echoed through every grain elevator and farmhouse, from Ohio to Nebraska. Plant fence row to fence row. He told the American farmer to get big or get out, and in Boone County, everyone was choosing to get big. The logic was simple, or at least it seemed so at the time. Export markets were booming. The Soviet Union was hungry for American grain, and the price of corn was climbing toward heights that made the old-timers blink in disbelief. The banks were doing their part, too. They weren't just lending money, they were practically shoving it across the desk, encouraging men to leverage their land to buy the newest, biggest, and most powerful equipment the world had ever seen. On the lot of the local John Deere dealership, the 4430 models were being replaced by the massive 4640 tractors, green and yellow giants with air-conditioned cabs that cost more than a starter home in Des Moines. Elias Vance stood in the middle of this whirlwind, a 52-year-old man with a face like a topographical map of the county he'd farmed his whole life. He was wearing his usual Carhartt jacket, the canvas faded to the color of dry corn husks and frayed at the cuffs where he'd rubbed against too many rusted gates. While his neighbors were talking about $3,000 an acre land and 8-row planters, Elias was looking at his soil. He didn't see a factory. He saw a living thing that was being asked to run a marathon without a single night of sleep. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. Elias found himself sitting in the wood-paneled office of the Boone County Savings and Loan, across from a young man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was wearing a suit that cost more than Elias's truck, and a smile that suggested he knew the future because he'd seen it on a spreadsheet. On the desk between them was a loan application for $100,000. "It's a no-brainer, Elias," Marcus said, tapping his gold pen against the paper. "With this capital, you can take delivery of that 4640 tomorrow. We can wrap in the 500 acres of the Miller place that's coming up for auction. You'd be doubling your footprint. With corn where it is, you'll cash flow the interest in 18 months. This is the era of the professional operator. You don't want to be left behind while everyone else is scaling up." Elias looked at the paper, then out the window at the main street of Boone. He saw a neighbor, a man he'd known for 30 years, driving a brand new silver Silverado. The man looked prosperous, but Elias noticed the way he was gripping the steering wheel, a tight, white-knuckled tension that didn't match the shiny paint. Elias thought about the 500 acres Marcus was talking about. It was good ground, but it would require more chemicals, more diesel, and more debt. It would mean he no longer worked for himself. He'd be working for the bank, and the bank was a hungry partner. "I think I'll pass, Marcus," Elias said quietly, pushing the paper back across the desk. The banker's smile didn't disappear, but it froze. "Pass? Elias, this is a prime opportunity. You have the equity. Your credit is spotless. Why on earth would you pass?" "Because I don't like the look of the sky," Elias replied. "The sky? The forecast is for a mild spring. We're looking at record yields." "I'm not talking about the weather for next week," Elias said, standing up. "I'm talking about the weather for 10 years from now. I think I'll just stick with what I've got." Elias walked out of the bank and drove his 1971 Ford pickup to the local feed store. The Ford had 140,000 miles on it, and the driver's side door groaned like a dying animal every time it opened. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and wood smoke. A group of farmers was gathered around the counter, their talk loud and boisterous, filled with the jargon of the Great Expansion. "Hey, Elias," called out a man named Ben Gentry. Ben was 30 years old and had just signed for a massive spread north of town. "Here you were at the bank. You getting that 4640? I'm picking mine up Friday. Things got more horsepower than a freight train." "No," Elias said, nodding to the clerk behind the counter. "I'm here for seed." "Corn?" Ben asked. "You trying that new high-yield hybrid everyone's talking about?" "No," Elias said. "I want red clover, alfalfa, and some Timothy grass. About 4,000 pounds worth to start." The store went quiet. The clerk, a man who had been weighing grain for 40 years, stopped with his hand on the scoop. "Clover, Elias, you're seeding down? This time of year? With corn at these prices, you ought to be plowing up every square inch of pasture you own." "I'm letting a third of my acreage rest," Elias said. ignoring the stunned looks from the men around him. "I'm turning the west quarter and the creek bottom back to grass and clover. I'm going to run some cattle through there instead of planting corn." A ripple of laughter went through the room. Ben Gentry leaned back against a stack of feed bags, a smirk on his face. "Elias, you're kidding, right? You're going to grow grass while the rest of us are growing gold. You've got some of the best black dirt in the state, and you're going to treat it like a golf course. That's not farming, that's retreating." "Call it what you want, Ben," Elias said, pulling out a roll of bills. He wasn't using a loan. He was using the meager savings he'd scratched together over 5 years of cautious living. "I also need to know if that old manure spreader you've got sitting out back is still for sale, the one with the rusted beater." The clerk nodded slowly. "Nobody's looked at that thing in years, Elias. It's an antique." "Then it fits me just fine," Elias said. By the end of that week, the story had traveled through Boone County like a wildfire through a dry wheat field. At the John Deere dealership, the equipment salesman, a man who lived on commissions from 6-figure sales, laughed until he was red in the face. He started calling Elias Antique Elias. Others were less kind. At the diner after Sunday church service, the whispers were thick. They said Elias had lost his nerve, that he was scared of the big leagues, that he was a debt dreader who would rather stay poor than take a risk. They watched from their high-horsepower cabs as Elias took his old Farmall M out into his fields. While they were pulling 12-row planters at 6 miles an hour, dropping expensive seed and chemical fertilizer into the ground, Elias was plodding along with his rusted manure spreader. He was spreading the waste from his small cattle herd and broadcasting clover seed over ground that should have been producing 150 bushels of corn. To the professional operators of 1976, Elias Vance wasn't just an eccentric. He was a fool who was turning his back on the greatest era of prosperity the American farmer had ever known. He was a man out of time, an obstacle in the path of progress, and they were certain that by harvest time, the numbers would prove them right and leave Elias in the dust of their success. Elias Vance didn't argue with the men at the feed store because he knew a secret they had forgotten, a secret buried in a trunk in his attic that was older than most of the tractors in the county. Every evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the Iowa wind turned cool, Elias sat at his heavy oak kitchen table with a single lamp and a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked and worn, the color of old mahogany, and on the inside cover was the name of his father, Silas Vance. The journal didn't contain accounts or ledgers. It contained a map of a man's survival during the most apocalyptic decade in American history. Elias would flip through the pages until he reached the entries from 1934, the year the sky over Boone County turned black with the ghosts of 1,000 farms. His father had written in a cramped, steady hand about the Dust Bowl the way the topsoil, that precious layer of earth that made life possible, simply blew away in the wind, leaving behind nothing but hard pan and despair. "When you treat the land like a factory, it eventually breaks," Silas had written in the summer of that terrible year. "The neighbors are plowing deeper and faster, chasing a ghost of a profit, but they are only grinding the soil into powder. Soil is not a machine. It is a living body, and a body needs rest. It needs to breathe. If you rob it of its soul for too many years, it will return the favor with dust." Elias had watched his father stay behind in 1936, when thousands of other Okies and Midwesterners packed their cars for California. Silas had survived, not by getting bigger, but by getting smarter, planting sorghum and clover when the wheat died, and rotating his small herd of cattle to keep the ground covered. He had paid for that knowledge with sweat and tears, and he had left it for Elias for free, if only Elias was wise enough to pay attention. Now, in 1976, Elias was applying those lessons to his own dead ground. To the neighbors, his decision to plant clover and let a third of his land rest looked like a retreat, but to Elias, it was a biological restoration. He understood the science that the men in the air-conditioned tractor cabs had ignored in favor of chemical jugs. He knew that red clover was a legume, a miracle of nature that did something no corn plant could ever do. Its roots formed a partnership with tiny bacteria called rhizobium, which literally pulled nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and fixed it into the soil in a form the plants could use. While his neighbors were paying $40 to $75 an acre for anhydrous ammonia, a fertilizer derived from expensive oil, Elias's clover was fixing 80 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre for the price of a bag of seed. But the nitrogen was only half the story. The clover roots went deep, much deeper than the shallow-rooted corn hybrids the neighbors were planting. These roots acted like tiny organic drills, punching through the heavy Iowa clay and creating channels, subterranean highways for water and air to penetrate the deep subsoil. When the clover died back, those channels remained open, and the decaying roots fed a hidden world. Elias could see the change when he knelt in his fields with a shovel. In the sections where he had seeded down the clover and spread manure from his rusted spreader, the earthworm count had skyrocketed. Where a year ago he might have found 2 worms in a cubic foot of soil, he was now finding 14. These worms were the engineers of the deep, turning decaying organic matter into rich humus and further aerating the ground. The soil was becoming darker and more aggregate, feeling like a moist sponge rather than a dry brick. Despite the biological victory happening beneath his boots, the social victory was nowhere to be found. The mockery at the Boone County diner was relentless. Every Tuesday, a group of farmers gathered for the coffee club, and Elias was their favorite topic of conversation. "Saw Antique Elias out there again this morning," Roy Dennison said, leaning over a plate of biscuits and gravy. Roy was a man who believed in horsepower above all else. He's still dragging that manure spreader with that old Farmall M. I could plow 5 acres in the time it takes him to grease that Antique. Does he really think he's going to make a mortgage payment on clover and cattle? I heard he turned down a $100,000 expansion loan, added Phil Kramer, the local equipment dealer. Phil was wearing a gold watch that caught the diner's fluorescent light as he gestured with a fork. Marcus Thorne over at the bank says Elias is terrified of debt, calls him a debt dreader. He thinks he can hide from the 20th century by planting weeds. It's embarrassing for the county, really. We've got men on the moon, and Elias Vance is farming like it's 1890. The men laughed, a chorus of certainty that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. They saw a man who was afraid of progress. They were convinced that farming was a game of volume, and that Elias had voluntarily benched himself. Elias's own wife, Dorothy, felt the sting of the whispers at church on Sunday morning. She had overheard 2 women talking in the vestibule about how they felt sorry for Dorothy Vance, married to a man who was stubborn as a mule. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Dorothy looked at the west quarter, where the red clover was starting to bloom in a soft, purple haze. "Elias," she said softly, "everyone is saying we're going to lose the farm because you won't be a real farmer. They say you're losing money every day you don't plant corn." Elias didn't look up from his pocket knife as he whittled a piece of cedar. "They're looking at the grain elevator prices, Dorothy. I'm looking at the soil. My father told me that the drought always comes back, and the market always crashes. He said to plant your sorghum, or in this case, our clover before the drought comes, not after, because after is too late." "But what if they're right?" she asked. "What if the good times never end?" Elias closed his knife with a sharp click. "Then I'll be the fool they say I am. I'll be a man with a small farm and healthy dirt. But if the music stops, and they've spent every dime they have on green paint and diesel, I'd rather be a debt dreader with a paid-for Farmall and land that can breathe. I'd rather be wrong and safe than right and destroyed." As the summer of 1976 progressed, the neighbors continued to expand, pulling their massive 8-row planters through the black dirt, betting their futures on a sky that had been kind for a long time. Elias just kept his head down, tending his clover, rotating his cattle, and adding his own notes to the leather-bound journal, the notes of a man who was willing to be laughed at for 30 years if it meant being the only one left standing when the wind finally changed. The 1970s had been a long, loud party for Boone County, but by the end of the decade, the music didn't just stop, the speakers blew out, and the lights went dark. For years, the neighbors of Elias Vance had lived by the gospel of expansion, fueled by cheap credit and the promise of endless markets. They had looked at their land as a line of credit and their tractors as status symbols. But in 1979, the first domino fell, and it fell with the weight of an entire world economy behind it. The Iranian Revolution began in January of 1979, and by the end of the year, the global oil supply had been choked off once again. In Boone County, the impact was immediate and brutal. Gasoline and diesel prices, which had already been climbing, suddenly tripled. For the farmers who had listened to the equipment dealers and bought the massive, high-horsepower tractors like the John Deere 4640, this was a disaster. Those green and yellow giants were marvels of engineering, but they were also thirsty monsters. They were designed to work thousands of acres at high speeds, but they required a constant, expensive diet of diesel to do it. Elias watched from his porch as his neighbor, Ben Gentry, pulled his brand-new tractor to the edge of the field, his face a mask of frustration. Ben was burning money just to keep the engine idling. The fuel that had cost 30 cents a gallon a few years earlier was now pushing toward $1.80. Every pass across the field was a calculated loss, and every gallon of diesel was a drain on a profit margin that was already starting to thin. Meanwhile, Elias's old Farmall M, the antique that everyone had laughed at, continued to plod along. It didn't have a 100-horsepower engine, and it didn't have an air-conditioned cab, but it also didn't require a king's ransom to operate. Elias used his mules of machinery, simple, efficient, and paid for, while the rest of the county was being bled dry by their own equipment. But the oil crisis was only the beginning. In January of 1980, the second blow landed. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Overnight, the primary export market for American corn and wheat vanished. The grain elevators in Boone County, which had been humming with activity and high prices, suddenly went quiet. Corn prices, which farmers had expected to stay above $3 a bushel, crashed toward $2.22. Soybeans followed the same downward trajectory. The gold that Ben Gentry and Roy Dennison had been planting was suddenly worth less than the cost of the chemicals used to grow it. Elias didn't have thousands of bushels of corn sitting in expensive new bins, waiting for a market that no longer existed. Because he had wrested a third of his land and focused on clover and cattle, his exposure to the market crash was limited. His cattle were still eating the grass and clover he had planted for the price of a few bags of seed. His soil was still building nitrogen for free, while his neighbors were staring at bills for petroleum-based fertilizers that they could no longer afford to pay. The final and most devastating blow came in 1981. To fight the rampant inflation that was tearing through the American economy, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to unprecedented levels. The prime rate hit 21.5%. For the farmers of Boone County, this was the steel punch. Most of them had expanded on credit, taking out operating loans at 9% that were now renewing at 18 or 20%. The interest alone on a new tractor or a few hundred acres of overpriced land was now more than the total income the farm could produce. The atmosphere at the Boone County grain elevator changed from boisterous confidence to a heavy, hollow silence. Farmers who had once bragged about their expansion now stood in small groups, looking at their boots and talking in low voices about acceleration notices and voluntary liquidation. Land values, which had been the collateral for all those big loans, began to collapse. In Iowa, the value of farmland would eventually drop 63% from its peak. The men who had laughed at Elias for being scared of debt now found themselves trapped in a cage made of high interest and low commodity prices. Roy Dennison was one of the first to feel the weight of the reckoning. He had leveraged his home farm to buy 320 acres to the north, believing the boom times would never end. Now, the bank was calling the loan, and the land he had bought for $3,000 an acre was appraising for less than $1,500. He was bleeding money every single day, and there was no end in sight. One afternoon, Elias ran into Phil Kramer, the equipment dealer, at the post office. Phil didn't look like the confident salesman who had mocked Elias at the diner 4 years earlier. His suit was rumpled, and the gold watch seemed too heavy for his wrist. His dealership was struggling as farmers stopped buying new equipment and started losing what they already had. "I suppose you're feeling pretty good about things, Elias," Phil said, his voice bitter and tired. "Sitting out there with your paid-for antiques while the rest of the world falls apart." Elias didn't gloat. He looked at Phil with a mixture of sadness and grim validation. "I don't feel good about any of this, Phil. These are my neighbors. These are my friends. I didn't want to see them lose their legacies." "But you knew," Phil insisted, shaking his head. "You knew this was coming. That's why you bought the clover. That's why you wouldn't sign for the 4640. "I didn't know exactly what would happen," Elias replied quietly. "I just knew that the man with the longest supply line is the man who loses when things get tight. My father's journal taught me that you can't predict the future, but you can prepare for the possibility of it being lean. I'd rather be a debt dreader who can still sleep at night than a professional operator who owes his soul to the bank." By the fall of 1981, the first foreclosures began in Boone County. The banks, which had been so eager to lend, were now sending out men in dark suits to take back the tractors and the land. The music hadn't just stopped, the bill had come due, and almost no one was able to pay it. Except for Elias Vance, who was still out in his fields with his old Farmall M, working soil that was deeper, darker, and more alive than it had been in a generation. If 1981 was the year the music stopped, then 1983 was the year the world itself seemed to catch fire. In the history of the Great Plains, There are years that are etched into the memories of farmers like scars, and 1983 was one of them. It wasn't just a dry spell. It was a brutal, relentless furnace that settled over Boone County and refused to leave. By July, the temperatures were hovering at 100 degrees day after day, and the sky remained a mocking, cloudless blue. In the fields surrounding Elias Vance's farm, the professional operators were watching their dreams wither in real time. The high-yield corn hybrids, which had been bred for peak performance under perfect conditions, were failing the ultimate test of survival. Because these neighbors had used heavy tillage and chemical fertilizers for years, their soil had lost its structure. It had become dense, like a brick, and when the moisture vanished, the earth cracked open in deep, jagged fissures. By noon every day, the neighbor's corn would roll its leaves, a defensive posture where the plant curls its blades into tight needles to prevent moisture loss. From the road, these fields looked like a sea of gray-green spikes, gasping for a breath of water that never came. But as you crossed the property line onto Elias's land, the world changed. Behind the shield of his long-term conservation practices, Elias's fields were a sanctuary of green in a world that was turning brown and brittle. The secret was in the sponge he had been building for 7 years. While his neighbors had mined their soil, Elias had restored his. Because he had rotated his crops with red clover and applied manure with his rusted spreader, the organic matter in his soil had risen significantly. In soil science, every 1% increase in organic matter allows the ground to hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre. Elias's soil was alive. The millions of root channels created by the clover and the miles of earthworm tunnels acted as a subterranean reservoir. When the occasional, sparse rains did fall, they didn't run off the surface as they did on the neighbors' compacted fields. They soaked deep into Elias's ground, held tight by the biology he had carefully nurtured. While the neighbor's corn was rolling, Elias's corn remained open and vibrant, its deep roots finding moisture that the modern hybrids couldn't reach. The financial contrast was even more jarring than the biological one. By late 1983, the professional operators were facing a math problem they couldn't solve. They were paying peak prices for diesel to run their massive tractors, peak prices for petroleum-based fertilizers, and peak interest on their operating loans, all for a crop that was destined to fail. They were spending $3 to grow $2 worth of corn. Elias, however, was operating on a different plane of existence. He hadn't spent a single penny on anhydrous ammonia fertilizer because his clover had fixed the nitrogen for him. He hadn't spent a fortune on diesel because his old Farmall M was only used for the essentials. And most importantly, he owed no interest to Marcus Thorne or the Boone County Savings and Loan. His operating costs were essentially zero compared to the hemorrhaging losses of the men who had laughed at him. The harvest of 1983 was a day of reckoning for Boone County. The county average for corn dropped to 75 bushels per acre. Many farmers harvested nothing at all, their fields too scorched to even warrant the fuel for a combine. But Elias Vance, on the land he had rested and retreated upon, brought in 134 bushels of corn per acre. With prices spiking due to the nationwide crop failure, Elias was the only man in the county with a surplus of grain and a deficit of debt. He took his check from the grain elevator, a significant sum paid in cash, and he didn't go to the John Deere dealership to buy green paint. He didn't go to the diner to gloat. He went to the kitchen table and opened his father Silas's journal to the page titled Patience. By the spring of 1985, the farm crisis had reached its peak. An investment company that had aggressively bought up land during the 1970s had gone bankrupt, and 100 acres bordering Elias's property was headed for the auction block. This was the Miller Place ground that had been farmed fence row to fence row until it was exhausted and gray. The bank was looking for a quick exit, and the rumors in town were that a large corporate syndicate from out of state was going to buy it, split it into small recreational parcels, and sell the soul of the farm for a quick profit. Elias Vance walked into the bank on a Monday morning, wearing the same faded Carhartt jacket. Marcus Thorne, the young banker who had once mocked him, now looked older, his eyes tired from 3 years of signing foreclosure papers. "I want to buy the Miller 100, Elias said, sliding a bank statement across the desk. Marcus looked at the numbers cash savings earned from years of clover, cattle, and survival, and his face went pale. $62,000? He whispered. "You have $62,000 in cash. 3 years of being antique Elias's adds up," Elias said, his voice firm, but without malice. "I'm offering the bank a fair price, more than they'll get at a distressed auction, but less than the boom prices of 79, and I'm paying in full today." "Why?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused. "You don't need more land, Elias. You've got enough to manage." "I'm not buying it to expand," Elias said, standing up to leave. "I'm buying it to save it. That ground has been screamed at for 10 years. It needs someone to let it be quiet for a while. It needs clover, and it needs a rest. If that syndicate buys it, they'll just finish what the chemicals started." Elias walked out with the deed to the 100 acres in his pocket. He hadn't become a professional operator, and he hadn't modernized into the 20th century. He had simply outlasted the madness by trusting the biology of the earth over the chemistry of the bank. As he drove his 1971 Ford past the Miller place, he didn't see a profit center. He saw a patient that was finally going to get some sleep. The retreater had become the only protector left in Boone County. The sunset over Boone County in 1998 looked much the same as it had in 1976, but the world beneath it had been transformed. Elias Vance sat on the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built, his body now reflecting the miles he had traveled and the soil he had saved. At 74 years old, his hands were gnarled like the roots of an old oak, but his eyes remained as sharp and clear as a winter morning. Sitting on the step below him was his grandson, Caleb, a young man of 24 who had just returned from Iowa State with a degree in agronomy and a head full of ideas. Caleb looked out over the West Quarter, where the hay was being cut for the final time of the season. The Miller place, once a scarred and gray expanse of exhausted dirt, was now a vibrant tapestry of deep green and gold. It was the most productive ground in the section, not because of the chemicals it had been fed, but because of the rest it had been given. Elias reached into the pocket of his worn Carhartt jacket and pulled out 2 items that represented the entirety of his life's philosophy. The first was a silver pocket watch, its casing smoothed by a century of thumbs. The second was the leather-bound journal of Elias Vance, the book that had acted as a compass during the storms of the 1980s. "It's time these went to you, Caleb," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. Caleb took the items with a reverence that showed he understood their weight. He ran his fingers over the cracked leather of the journal. "I remember when the neighbors used to call you Antique Elias, Grandpa. Dad told me about the meetings at the diner and how they laughed when you bought the clover instead of the big green iron." Elias chuckled, a dry sound like wind moving through corn husks. "They laughed because they were looking at the surface, Caleb. They saw an old man with an old tractor and they thought I was retreating from the future. They didn't understand that sometimes moving forward requires you to take a step back and listen to the ones who came before. They were focused on the size of their machines and the length of their credit lines. I was focused on the one thing that actually makes a farmer, the dirt." He gestured with a trembling hand toward the fields. "You spent 4 years in Ames learning about nitrogen cycles and aggregate stability, and that's good knowledge. But don't ever let a textbook or a salesman tell you that you can outsmart nature. When you force the land to work like a factory, it eventually breaks. My father saw it in the 30s during the Dust Bowl, when the sky turned black, because men thought they could plow their way to heaven. I saw it in the 80s, when men thought they could borrow their way to a kingdom." Elias leaned forward, his gaze boring into his grandson. "Listen to me, Caleb. This is the only advice that matters. Don't spend your life looking into the pockets of other men to see how they're doing. Don't chase the neighbors and don't chase the bank. Instead, look at the color of your soil. If the soil is dark, if it's deep, and if it's full of life, you will never truly be poor. But if your soil is gray and your debt is high, it doesn't matter how many 1,000-acre spreads you own, you're just a tenant on a dying empire." Elias Vance passed away in 2007 at the age of 83. His funeral was not a quiet affair. Farmers came from 3 counties, driving trucks that were often newer than Elias's, but working land that had been saved by his example. Men who had once laughed at Antique Elias stood in line to tell Caleb how his grandfather had quietly helped them restructure their rotations or loaned them seed when the banks wouldn't give them a dime. Today, the Vance farm is a landmark in Boone County. Caleb Vance runs the 800 acres with a mixture of modern science and ancient wisdom. He uses a tractor with a GPS guidance system, but in the shed, under a clean tarp, sits the old Farmall M. Every spring, before the first seed hits the ground, Caleb starts the antique engine just to hear it run, a mechanical heartbeat that reminds him of where he came from. He never plants a crop without checking the leather-bound journal first. He still lets 1/3 of the land rest in rotation, and he still plants clover to fix the nitrogen for free. While other farms in the county have been consolidated by large out-of-state corporations, the Vance land remains in the family, debt-free and thriving. Visitors often stop by the fence line to admire the dark, rich color of the soil or the clarity of the creek that runs through the bottomland. They ask Caleb how he manages to maintain such high yields without the massive chemical bills his neighbors pay. Caleb always gives the same answer, the one his grandfather taught him on the porch all those years ago. "I'm just a retreater," he says with a knowing smile. "I don't look at the market, and I don't look at the bank. I just look at the soil. Because if the soil is healthy, the rest takes care of itself." The legacy of Elias Vance isn't written in the ledger of a bank or the sales records of a dealership. It is written in the deep, black earth of Boone County, a story of patience, a story of biology, and a story of a man who was wise enough to be called a fool so that his grandchildren could be called farmers. The wind still blows across the Iowa prairie, and the sun still sets over the Des Moines lobe, but on the Vance farm, the ground is staying put. And in a world that is always rushing toward the next big thing, that is the greatest victory of all.